Tuesday, the 16th of January, 2024, 9 a.m. At a quiet storage yard in Widnes, Cheshire, 3 men arrived to collect a shipment that had travelled thousands of miles across the Atlantic. Within minutes, plainclothes officers watching nearby would move in, uncovering something far more serious than routine freight. Years later, Wednesday, 10th September, 2025. At Chelmsford Crown Court, a group of men stood in silence as the judge read out the sentences. What began as a daring sailing expedition had turned into one of Britain's most ambitious drug trafficking investigations. And finally, in a small cafe in Kent, 3 older men leaned over their mugs of tea, whispering about a delivery they said would make them rich. What they didn't know was that every word was being recorded, and within days their plan would collapse on a roadside hundreds of miles away. 3 moments, 3 operations, each one revealing how ordinary settings can hide extraordinary crimes. This is the story of 3 major organised smuggling plots, and how precision, greed and overconfidence led every one of them to fall apart. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Chen, 29 years old, lived quietly in a modest terraced house on Birchfield Road, Liverpool. To neighbours, he was polite, unassuming, someone who kept to himself. But beneath that calm exterior, Chen was running one of the most carefully structured cannabis import networks uncovered in Cheshire in recent years. He was the architect of the operation, a man who treated smuggling like a business plan, testing every variable before taking the real risk. Before the major import that would eventually bring him down, Chen had spent months experimenting with smaller postal shipments. Parcels sent from Canada arrived through ordinary courier routes, concealed within legitimate goods, trial runs designed to test which ports, which companies, and which customs checks could be bypassed. Those smaller loads were never enough to draw attention, but they gave him data, which labels worked, how long shipments took, and which routes were least likely to trigger suspicion. When he was confident, Chen scaled up. He rented a storage unit at the storage team, Tanhouse Lane, Widnes, under a name not publicly linked to him. The unit appeared under a clean business name, listed for basic storage, nothing unusual. From there, Chen coordinated every stage of the operation: freight documentation, transport schedules, and distribution once the load arrived. His communications were handled through encrypted phones, devices later traced to suppliers in Canada and distributors across Merseyside. Among his closest partners were John and Luke Kinsellas, 2 brothers from Liverpool. John, 34, of St Julian Drive, was already known to police as a regular buyer from Chen's smaller consignments. For him, this new shipment promised a major payoff: hundreds of kilos ready for onward distribution across Merseyside. Luke, 23, had no fixed address and no criminal record at the time. His job was simple: move the goods, unload when they arrived, and handle storage. Payment would come not in cash, but in cannabis he could sell himself. When police later pieced together the messages, the routes, and the surveillance footage, it became clear. Both brothers knew exactly what they were dealing with. They weren't couriers caught in the middle. Instead, they were partners in a multi-million-pound import plan, each playing their part in a system designed to look legitimate until the moment it wasn't. The conspiracy ran quietly in the background for months, from September 2023 until 16th January 2024. Chen had refined his network into a smooth, almost corporate supply chain. His product was cannabis, with international routes that came through legitimate freight channels from Canada, hidden among containers of household furniture. Goods that drew no second glance on manifests or custom screens. But beneath the clean documentation, small inconsistencies began to surface. Customs intelligence analysts flagged a repeated importer name linked to shipments of unusual weight for domestic furniture. At the same time, local officers from Cheshire Police noticed patterns of vehicle activity around certain industrial units. By early January 2024, detectives were certain they were looking at an organised smuggling operation. A joint surveillance plan was authorised. Unmarked cars monitored vehicle movements between Liverpool, Widnes and Runcorn, while phone data analysts began tracking the encrypted communications later proven to belong to Chen and his associates. By the second week of January, the pieces had aligned. Intelligence suggested a new container, larger than previous shipments, was on its way from Canada, due to arrive through the port of Liverpool. What no one outside the investigation knew then was that this would be the shipment that exposed the entire network. On the morning of the 15th of January, 2024, an orange shipping container rolled off a cargo vessel that had just docked at the port of Liverpool. It had crossed the same route, carrying 8 bed frames with matching mattresses. The paperwork was complete. There was nothing on the surface to suggest anything out of the ordinary. Once cleared by port handlers, the container was loaded onto a heavy goods vehicle and transported inland to the storage team warehouse. To anyone watching casually, it looked like a standard furniture delivery, one of hundreds that passed through the estate each week. But when officers later opened those mattresses, they found something else entirely. At 9 a.m., the quiet routine of the Widnes industrial estate was interrupted by the arrival of several vehicles at the storage team warehouse. Surveillance cameras, positioned by Cheshire Police weeks in advance, captured every moment. One car stood out, a black Audi A3, registered to John Kinsellas. Inside were John, his younger brother Luke, and the operations organizer, Chen. They drove in through the yard gates, parked alongside the newly delivered orange container, and began to work with a quiet urgency. Unaware that the entire scene was being streamed live to an operations room nearby, the trio began opening the container's rear doors. The footage showed them examining the wrapped mattresses, shifting them one by one from the lorry bed to the storage area. It was routine for them, careful, deliberate, and familiar. But to officers watching from a distance, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The decision to strike had been planned down to the second. As soon as the men started handling the suspected load, a pre-arranged tactical signal was given. Within moments, armed officers from Cheshire Constabulary's Serious and Organised Crime Unit entered the site. Plainclothes surveillance teams moved in from both ends of the yard, while marked units blocked the exits. Shouts echoed across the yard as the men were ordered to the ground. A brief struggle followed, but the scene was under control within seconds. All 3 suspects, Chen, John, and Luke Kinsellas, were detained on site. Officers immediately began a systematic search of the container and the surrounding unit. Inside, they found the mattresses, still sealed and stacked neatly. Several were cut open under police supervision, revealing the first of the vacuum-sealed cannabis parcels concealed within. The full scale of the operation became immediately clear. Officers counted 668 vacuum-sealed packages, a total of 334 kilograms of cannabis. Forensic teams worked methodically through the day, documenting serial markings. Investigators also recovered shipping manifests and storage agreements, all tied to the false identity he'd used to rent the storage space. The forged lease became a key link, proving his control over the property where the drugs were discovered. During searches of the suspects' vehicles, detectives found multiple mobile phones, including encrypted handsets later analyzed by Cheshire Police's Digital Forensics Unit. Data extraction revealed a chain of group messages arranging meeting times, vehicle logistics, and payments. The terminology used matched that of earlier intercepted communications, coded references to frames and foam, consistent with the concealment method. Specialist analysts also uncovered evidence of EncroChat-style encryption software, confirming that Chen and his associates were using systems designed to prevent interception. Reports had not revealed any name, but the structure was nearly identical. These findings connected Chen's communication methods to patterns seen in wider organised crime operations across the Northwest. At Liverpool Crown Court, CPS prosecutor Olivia Cristianecci-Travis described the case as an industrial-scale importation operation disguised as domestic freight. By the autumn of 2024, the investigation that began with months of surveillance and a single container had reached its conclusion in court. On the 8th of October 2024, Chen, John Kinsellas, and Luke Kinsellas appeared before Liverpool Crown Court, facing charges of conspiracy to import and supply Class B drugs. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and what we have already covered. One by one, each man entered a guilty plea, acknowledging their role in the operation that had brought more than 300 kilos of cannabis into the country. When sentencing was passed, Chen received 7 years imprisonment. John Kinsellas was handed 6 years and 6 months, while Luke Kinsellas was sentenced to 4 years. In total, the trio faced 17 years and 6 months behind bars. For investigators, the case was more than just another drug conviction. But while Chen's operation ended in a storage yard in Widnes, another network, hundreds of miles away, was already plotting something far bolder and far more ambitious. The second investigation led police deep into the heart of Essex, into a sophisticated criminal network whose plans stretched across oceans. Uncovered under Operation Venetic, this case was one of the most complex probes into organised drug trafficking ever coordinated by the UK's Organised Crime Partnership, a joint task force of the National Crime Agency and the Metropolitan Police Service. At its centre was Lee McClenaghan, 57, of Chelmsford, known on the encrypted EncroChat network as Cat with 9 Lives. Investigators later described him as the driving force, the strategist behind every major shipment. His right-hand man, Leah Talbot, 55, of Chadwell St Mary, used the alias Legitimate Yak. Together, they built a logistics network capable of moving tons of drugs across continents, disguised behind legitimate-looking trade routes. But McClenaghan and Talbot were far from working alone. The group's structure mirrored a business hierarchy, specialists assigned to sourcing, transport, finance, and cover operations. Among the trusted associates who made up the wider network were several men who each played a crucial yet specialized role in keeping the operation running. Daniel Braithwaite, aged 61 and from Westcliff-on-Sea, acted as the group's financial coordinator, handling prices, payments, and the flow of money between suppliers and distributors. Ian Magee, 68, from Chelmsford, brought his years of sailing experience to the organization. We will talk about him in a few minutes. The financial side of the conspiracy was further supported by John Campbell, 69, of London, who acted as a fixer. He created fraudulent payments and front companies to disguise transactions and to help secure the release of shipments when they arrived in Europe. Working abroad, Carl Richter, 52, from Swansea, served as a vital link to contacts in South Africa, where one of the group's major cannabis consignments originated. He coordinated closely with Kane Ward, 60, from Upminster, who handled domestic arrangements once the imported drugs reached British soil. Ward was responsible for storage logistics and ensuring the safe distribution of the loads once they cleared customs. Moreover, the organization relied on legitimate-looking businesses to hide its movements. Paul Tozer, 61, from Epping, owned a textile firm that was used as the delivery address for a 400-kilo cannabis importation. Stephen Persod, 41, from Upminster, ran a freight forwarding company that managed incoming loads through multiple ports. Meanwhile, Sundeep Gruel, 37, from Grays, used his food business in Tilbury to provide another layer of cover, allowing illicit consignments to appear as ordinary imports of commercial goods. Together, these men formed the operational backbone of McClenaghan and Talbot's network, a structure that combined maritime experience, commercial credibility, and financial manipulation to mask the scale of their international drug smuggling enterprise, but one that would soon come apart under the weight of its own ambition. The plan was as bold as it was elaborate. A 600-kilogram shipment of cocaine hidden aboard a yacht racing across the Atlantic. Lee McClenaghan mapped out a scheme that blended the thrill of a legitimate sporting event with the precision of organized smuggling. His idea was to enter a vessel in an annual transatlantic sailing race, running from St. Lucia in the Caribbean to Lagos, Portugal, and to use the competition as a cover to transport the cocaine undetected. To make the plan viable, McClenaghan needed experience and trust. He brought in Ian Margie, a 68-year-old professional sailor. In 2019, Margie sailed a yacht named Ocean Magic in the same race. Investigators would later describe this as a dummy run, a trial voyage designed to test conditions, routes and timing without carrying drugs. It gave McClenaghan the information he needed: how long the crossing took, which ports inspected vessels, and where to make contact out of sight of authorities. By early 2020, preparations for the real operation were underway. Maggie and another sailor purchased a second vessel, the Soterius, intended to carry a half-ton of cocaine from South America to Europe. Meanwhile, McClenaghan dispatched his trusted associate, Leah Talbot, to Venezuela, where he met cartel representatives to finalize the logistics. The plan was to load the cocaine before the yacht departed, then sail it across the Atlantic disguised as a legitimate competitor in the race. A method investigators later called a textbook example of criminal innovation. For nearly 2 years, they refined every detail. Routes were charted, drop-off locations discussed, and schedules synchronized. If successful, the smuggling run could have generated tens of millions in profit. But by May 2020, the plan collapsed, not because of law enforcement, but because the COVID-19 pandemic forced organizers to cancel the entire race. With his transatlantic route gone, McClenaghan was forced to adapt. He began exploring new ways to move multi-ton quantities of cocaine from South America, this time hidden in shipping containers filled with fruit and vegetables. And we will talk about it in a few minutes. The race that never happened had spared the group one disaster. But their next venture would push their luck even further. They thought they were untouchable. Hidden behind encrypted handsets and digital aliases, their conversations were supposed to vanish with every message sent. But in June 2020, that illusion shattered with the EncroChat breach. I will not go into those details, as you have already heard many of the stories. But with the decrypted data, the full scale of the Essex network began to unfold. The handles were traced back to Lee McClenaghan and Leah Talbot, who had used the platform to discuss their operational details that we have already covered. Operation Venetic, led by the Organised Crime Partnership, quickly moved in. Financial investigators traced payments made for one of the yachts, including £100,000 linked to Ian Margie, the group's appointed sailor. On other devices seized while arresting them, officers recovered photos showing Leah Talbot meeting with Venezuelan cartel representatives and sailing crew members in the Caribbean. Imagery that turned digital chatter into hard proof. Detective Inspector Richard Smith from the Organised Crime Partnership called it one of the most sophisticated smuggling plots ever dismantled through EncroChat evidence. When the transatlantic yacht plan collapsed, Lee McClenaghan didn't stop. He simply changed course. By late 2021, the focus had shifted from cocaine at sea to industrial-scale cannabis shipments, consignments hidden within legitimate commercial freight. In March 2022, a new consignment arrived at Tilbury Port in Essex. On paper, it was routine cargo, a wooden crate declared as a machine lathe imported from South Africa. Everything appeared in order. The paperwork matched, the exporter was listed as an engineering supplier, and the delivery address pointed to a textile business in Epping, owned by Paul Tozer. But when Border Force officers carried out a targeted inspection, they found something else entirely. Inside the machinery's casing, officers uncovered hundreds of tightly wrapped vacuum-sealed packages. By the time the search was complete, the haul totaled 408 kilograms of cannabis, one of the largest seizures recorded at Tilbury that year. The operation was directly linked to Lee McClenaghan, Daniel Braithwaite, and Paul Tozer. Their communication records later showed discussions about timing, logistics, and expected values for the incoming load, conversations that matched the timeline of the seized container almost exactly. But this time, the drugs never reached them. The entire consignment was intercepted before collection, thanks to intelligence shared between Border Force and the Organised Crime Partnership, OCP. Officers tracked the shipment's route, confirmed its origin, and gathered forensic evidence linking it directly to McClenaghan's network. They did not move straight to arrests. Instead of charging the suspects at once, investigators kept the Tilbury seizure and the intelligence around it largely covert, a deliberate decision to avoid tipping off the wider network. Officers continued to watch, quietly building links between phone logs, shipping records, and company paperwork so they could map the full supply chain rather than disrupt only one shipment. To those outside the inquiry, the load appeared simply lost or delayed in the paperwork. The conspirators carried on believing their routes still worked. Confident the operation remained viable, the network pushed on, switching routes and suppliers, and before long they attempted another import, this time from Vancouver. By mid-2023, the network had adapted again. The methods were the same: legitimate shipping routes, clean paperwork, and cover businesses designed to make every container look ordinary. In July 2023, a container arrived at Southampton Port, declared as holding 20 industrial tower toolboxes. The documentation listed a genuine supplier, and to casual inspection, the shipment appeared routine. Yet experience had taught Border Force officers where to look. During a detailed search, they drilled into the base of one of the metal toolboxes and uncovered tightly wrapped packages. Within hours, the count stood at 268 kilograms of cannabis, vacuum sealed and packed inside the compartments of every unit. The investigation would later show that the operation was organized by Leah Talbot. He coordinated the shipment with Stephen Persaud and Sundeep Gruel, who provided the delivery address to disguise the true nature of the cargo, and of course, Paul Tozer, John Campbell, the same method used in previous operations. When investigators compared the seizure with the earlier interception at Tilbury, the scale became undeniable. Across the two cannabis imports from South Africa and Vancouver, the total reached 676 kilograms, evidence of a network operating at industrial capacity and willing to exploit global supply routes for profit. Within weeks of the Southampton interception, the operation moved from observation to enforcement. Coordinated raids were carried out across Essex, Kent, and South Wales, targeting every key member of the network. McClenaghan, Talbot, and their associates were taken into custody under the supervision of the Organised Crime Partnership, OCP, ending more than 4 years of investigation. Proceedings took place at Chelmsford Crown Court throughout 2024, with each defendant facing charges that reflected their specific roles within the network. When sentencing was finally passed in October 2024, the scale of justice mirrored the scale of the operation. Lee McClenaghan, 57, was handed 30 years imprisonment. Leah Talbot, 55, received 23 years, while Daniel Braithwaite, 61, was sentenced to 22 years. Ian Magee, 68, was jailed for 20 years. Others faced their own penalties. John Campbell, 69, received 10 years. Kane Ward, 60, was sentenced to 6 years and 6 months, while Carl Richter, 52, received 11 years, following his conviction on 16 October 2024. Sundeep Gruel, 37, was given 40 months, Stephen Persaud, 41, 32 months, and Paul Tozer, 61, handed down 6 years of imprisonment. In total, the group received more than 111 years of imprisonment, a sentence that effectively dismantled the network once described as one of the most organized under Operation Venetic. It was a warm July morning in 2020 when 3 men met at a small café on the outskirts of Kent. To anyone watching from the street, they looked like old friends, relaxed, laughing over breakfast. But hidden microphones told a different story. Inside the café, every word was being recorded by covert listening devices, placed there by the National Crime Agency on the intelligence or maybe some grass. The voices captured belonged to Mark Ewell, aged 64, Alfred Rumbold, 65, and Brian Wright, 73, all veterans of the freight and removals trade. Wright was the owner of P&D Removals, a long-running transport company established in Kent back in 1972. Ewell and Rumbold were both experienced hauliers, men who understood shipping routes, customs paperwork, and how to move goods across borders without drawing attention. The recording would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Over coffee and sandwiches, the three men spoke in careful tones about border checks, vehicle schedules, and the profits that could be made if everything went to plan. One of them boasted they were about to hit the jackpot, a phrase that would echo through courtrooms years later. Investigators listening from a distance already knew they were dealing with something beyond routine smuggling. Intelligence suggested the trio were linked to a Merseyside-based organised crime group known for large-scale cocaine importation. The Café meeting lasted just under an hour, but it set the entire operation in motion. He drove out in a working van, the sort of routine journey a removals firm makes dozens of times a year. But this was a test, not a delivery. Brian Wright took his lorry across the channel to the Netherlands and treated the route like a rehearsal for something far larger. The purpose was clinical: assess the practical choke points. On the return, he made careful notes on his phone, references to border checks, timings at ferry and port checkpoints where inspections were light and where delays occurred. NCA surveillance teams were already watching. Covert listening and tracking recorded the progress, and the journey was stitched into a growing pattern of activity investigators were piecing together. It was not a one-off curiosity. It matched other intelligence showing contact between the Kent men and Merseyside's organised group. For investigators, the dummy run confirmed what they suspected. These men were preparing to use a legitimate transport business as a vehicle for a high-value Class A import. On his return, he met his two co-conspirators and ran through what had been learned. Those debriefs were not boastful. They were operational. Each detail fed into a plan that relied heavily on vanishing in plain sight. A week after the test journey, the plan went live. Brian Wright loaded his lorry once again, this time not with furniture or removal stock, but with large glass fish tanks carefully sealed and stacked in the rear. On paper, it was another legitimate delivery from his Kent-based business to the Netherlands. In reality, those tanks carried a hidden payload worth millions. Inside the tank frames and sealant compartments, Dutch investigators would later find 20.5 kilograms of heroin, 32 kilograms of cocaine, and 3 kilograms of MDMA, a combined weight of 55 kilograms and a potential street value of £4.5 million. Every layer of concealment had been engineered to look ordinary. The drugs were encased in adhesive linings, invisible to a cursory inspection, and only revealed once the tanks were dismantled. The operation had been months in the making, but by now, the National Crime Agency had already ensured the outcome. Working with the Dutch National Police, the NCA shared full intelligence from the earlier dummy run, including vehicle tracking data and Wright's likely route. As Wright crossed into the Netherlands, surveillance followed from a distance, waiting for confirmation that the handover would take place. Before he could deliver the cargo, the trap closed. In the early hours near Utrecht, Dutch officers surrounded the parked lorry as Wright slept inside. He was detained on the spot. When investigators opened the vehicle, the fish tanks were removed one by one, revealing the concealed narcotics beneath layers of silicone sealant and plastic sheeting. Back in the UK, coordinated arrests were already in motion. At their home addresses, Mark Ewell and Alfred Rumbold were taken into custody by NCA officers. Searches uncovered encrypted phones, handwritten notes, and bundles of cash, all linked to the planned importation. When officers began examining the seized devices, the scale of the network became clear. Among the evidence recovered were encrypted handsets, EncroChat and Sky, ECC devices. These phones contained fragments of messages, contact lists, and transaction notes that connected the Kent trio to a wider organized crime group already under investigation across Europe. When questioned, Brian Wright denied any knowledge of the drugs. He claimed he believed he was hauling furniture for a legitimate client. Ewell and Rumbold, on the other hand, tried a different story, insisting they thought they were moving alcohol and tobacco, not Class A narcotics. But the data told another tale. Through digital attribution, financial records, and surveillance evidence, NCA investigators were able to prove coordination and intent beyond doubt. The encrypted exchanges, when paired with the Café recordings and Wright's dummy run, painted a complete picture: deliberate planning, concealment, and trafficking. In court, prosecutors described the case as an example of how EncroChat intelligence had transformed the fight against organized crime, exposing not only the new digital players, but also the old-school couriers who believed experience and routine could still hide them from view. The case reached its conclusion at Isleworth Crown Court in November 2021, following a 7-week trial that dissected every detail of the conspiracy. After weeks of evidence, the jury returned unanimous verdicts. All 3 men were found guilty of conspiring to import Class A drugs. Following conviction, Wright's Rolls-Royce, company vehicles and other business assets were seized under the Proceeds of Crime Act, ensuring none would profit from the crime. When sentencing was passed on 19th of November 2021, the punishments reflected both the scale of the operation and the experience of those involved. Mark Ewell, then 64, was sentenced to 14 years imprisonment. Alfred Rumbold, 65, received 14 years. Brian Wright, 73, was jailed for 12 years. In total, the trio faced 40 years in prison. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.